People with creepy neighbors, what did they do? When I moved into my new apartment, an African exchange student invited himself in. He brought an open bottle of red wine and insisted that I drink with him, but I refused. Looking back, my biggest mistake was letting him into my home. I was in the process of rebuilding my life after some difficult times and wanted to meet new people, so I didn't initially think there was anything strange about the situation. That was until I noticed the wine. He then made a creepy request for me to sit on his lap, and when I declined, he became very pushy. That's when I realized I was in a dangerous situation, and if I didn't act fast, I was probably going to be in trouble. I remembered one of the neighbors telling me that someone living nearby was a neo-Nazi, so I quickly made up a story. I pointed to the windows across from mine, which didn't have curtains yet, and told him how scary it was to live next to someone like that. I hoped the story would make him feel uncomfortable enough to leave. I managed to say I had to do my homework and would love to talk another time, thanking him for the wine. At the door, he hugged me and I thought, this is it. He's really strong, I have no chance. He leaned in to kiss me, but I said something, I can't remember exactly what, but it convinced him to leave and that we'd talk later. As soon as he was out of my apartment, I spent the rest of the day kicking myself for being so naive and vulnerable. Things only got worse after that. He began standing outside my window at night, peering in. I got curtains. Then, one evening when my dad was visiting, I noticed through the curtains that the guy was outside again, with 4 or 5 of his friends, all wearing hoodies and just standing there. It was late, and they had been doing this regularly. I told my dad, and he yanked the curtains open and gave them the most intense death glare. The group scattered immediately, and I never saw them again. Shortly after, someone stole the seat off my bicycle. When I replaced it and went to install the new seat, the rest of my bike was gone. Maybe it was just a coincidence, but I couldn't help but think it was the same guy, trying to mess with me. I've had plenty of strange and unsettling neighbors, but none of them made me feel as anxious as that guy did. I still can't believe I wasn't assaulted that day. Everything about him was predatory. Story 2. When I was 7, my family lived in a rough neighborhood. One night, it was just my mom, my 2 siblings, and me at home while my dad was away on a business trip. Around midnight, someone started knocking on our door. My mom woke up, went to the front door, and asked who it was, but no one answered. She thought it might have been some kids playing ding-dong ditch, so she went back to bed. About 30 minutes later, the knocking started again. This time, she got up and looked out the side window but saw no one there. Worried, she grabbed my dad's shotgun and sat in the dark living room, waiting. Then the knocking came once more. My mom shouted at whoever it was, saying she was going to call the cops and that if anyone tried to come in, she would shoot them. Around 2 a.m., the police arrived and did a quick search outside while we stayed inside. Afterward, they told my mom they found a piece of barbed wire about 4 feet long near the front door and asked if it belonged to her. She said it didn't, and when she asked why, the officer explained that the person knocking had planned to use the barbed wire to strangle her when she opened the door. The officer told her she had been very smart not to open it, or it could have cost her life. They said they'd patrol the neighborhood until morning and do a full investigation once daylight came. The next morning, while continuing their search, the police found footprints leading around to the back of the house, up to my bedroom window. They also found nicks in the windowsill, where the person had tried to pry the window open to break in but failed. My mom had always suspected it was a neighbor, as he would often stare at her through his curtains and wasn't very friendly. He also seemed to know when my dad wasn't home, since he'd seen his vehicle. After that, we moved out of the house. Story 3. So, my aunt lives next door to us, which would be fine if she weren't a sociopath. The house we live in used to belong to her and my dad growing up, and about 10 years ago, we moved in with my grandmother. My aunt would come over to fill up my nan's car with gas and secretly copy the house key. She started sneaking into our house late at night and stealing the oddest things. At first, we didn't notice, but then we realized things like shampoo bottles would be empty, paper towels and toilet paper were missing, food, silverware, and even cups were gone. Eventually, we found my mom's jewelry on the stairs, as if she dropped it while leaving. One night, I happened to be wide awake around 2:30 a.m. I heard what I thought was one of my parents going upstairs, entering their room, and then a few minutes later coming back downstairs. The dog's tail was wagging, so I wasn't scared until the next morning when my parents asked if I had been up late and went into their room. The thing was, my aunt didn't try to sneak, she stomped up the stairs, down the hall, like she didn't care. My dog was so used to her coming around that it made for the worst guard dog ever. We changed the locks and installed a special coded door for the staircase. But instead of coming upstairs, she would start coming by around 5 to 6 a.m. before my mom and I woke up for school. We'd hear the front door slam as soon as our alarms went off, and if we rushed to the window, we'd see her going back to her house. We changed the locks again, and the late-night visits seemed to stop after that. I could go on about more messed up stuff she did, but this is long enough. Story 4. I had a really creepy neighbor when I was in 7th grade. He was probably in his early 40s, and while he was always polite, there was just something off about him. My mom was very patriotic, so our house was decorated in red, white, and blue. One day, while I was walking home from school, he was sitting on his front lawn and told me he was having a red, white, and blue sale in his backyard and that I should check it out. I told him I would, but I needed to go get some money first, and I walked off. The neighbor next to us was a big guy in his mid-30s, covered in prison tattoos, but he'd turned his life around and was actually a really nice guy, though very intimidating if you didn't know him. Since my parents weren't home, I went over to his house and told him what happened. He came with me to the creepy neighbor's house, and the guy took us to his backyard. Sure enough, there were all sorts of red, white, and blue items for sale. Even though nothing overtly dangerous happened, I still felt something was off. 2 years later, that neighbor was arrested for attempting to lure a child into his house. For clarification, I knew better than to go into his backyard, which is why I went to Prison Tattoo Guide for help. I wanted someone to know about it, just in case he tried something with me or came to my house. After we left the creepy neighbor's house, Prison Tattoo Guy told me he called the cops because something just didn't feel right. He also spoke to my parents, which makes sense now, since they started making me walk home on the other side of the street. Story 5. When I was 20, I moved into a second-story apartment in a complex. My downstairs neighbor, a man in his 40s who lived alone, quickly became a concern. Within just 2 days of living there, he started making plans that included me, his 12-year-old daughter, whom he had partial custody of on weekends, and himself. He suggested outings like trips to the zoo, movies, and dinners, and immediately began inviting me to his place. He even followed me into my apartment under the pretense of being gentlemanly and wanting to make sure I was safe, despite the fact we lived only a few feet apart. It wasn't long before he confessed to feeling a sense of infatuation and physical tension with me. I got the distinct impression he was trying to find a replacement mother figure for his daughter or start a relationship with me out of desperation. He had mentioned going through a terrible divorce, which explained how he ended up at the apartment complex. I felt uncomfortable and raised my concerns with the landlord. Her response? She dismissed it, saying I should just ignore him because that's just how he is. Left with little support, I avoided him as much as possible. Despite his offer to help pay my rent, I eventually moved out, not just to escape his behavior, but also due to financial struggles. Story 6. When I was growing up, there was a middle-aged woman who lived across the street with her young daughter. Every day, I'd watch her walk down the road carrying 2 large laundry bags, and later she'd return with them. This routine seemed to happen almost every day, and I remember being curious about why just the 2 of them seemed to have so much laundry to do so frequently. Years later, my mom explained that the woman had been a refugee from Nazi Germany. She was terrified that if she left the house, the Nazis might raid it while she was gone. So, she always carried all of her clothes with her. Everywhere. Story 7. I lived in an apartment building and at night, I'd hear strange scratching sounds at my door, like someone was trying to get in, followed by knocking. It happened a few times, and I answered the door twice because the guy really scared me. Each time, he'd show up wearing nothing but an open bathrobe, claiming he just wanted to talk. The second time he knocked, I called the cops and told them everything. A 20-year-old girl living alone and a middle-aged man trying to get into her apartment? It was terrifying. After I reported it, the cops and my landlady must have worked together because he stopped coming around. Story 8. My current neighbor is an older guy, and I live in a rural area. He lives about a 3-minute drive down the road, and at one point, his mailbox was next to mine. He used to go through my mail and then bring it to my door. He would even steal my magazines and put them back a day or 2 later. I eventually got a locking mailbox, but one day it mysteriously fell over. He came over in a panic, claiming that the locking mailbox was too heavy and that I had to use a regular one instead. I called the sheriff on him, and a few days later, he got a new mailbox installed at his house. He also had a habit of going through my recycling, then judging me based on the amount of alcohol bottles he found. The funny part is, I barely drink, and I usually have a month or 2's worth of bottles at a time. He thought I was constantly on some bender. Finally, one day he came over to tell me to clean my gutters. I told him to get the hell out of my face and never come over uninvited again. A few days later, he drove up and asked, "So when's that invite coming?" I thought my wife and I were supposed to get an invite soon. I told him, "Never. Get the hell out of here. You creep me out." Story 9. My wife and I had a neighbor in the apartment complex we used to live in, who we referred to as Creepy Guy. He had some sort of mental disorder and would wander around the complex all day, snooping into everyone's business. Once, one of our neighbors caught him cracking open the front door to peek inside. Whenever I left in the morning, he would come rushing out of his apartment to see who was leaving. The bottom floor of our building was partly underground, so the windows were at ground level. If you didn't keep your blinds closed, he'd peek inside. Maintenance would also catch him sneaking into vacant apartments that they were working on. The final straw came when my wife went to check the mail. The mailboxes were located in a central area of the complex, and he followed her there and back, wearing a thick leather jacket in 90-degree heat. My wife reported it, and management finally decided to evict him. After that, he spent the rest of his time there muttering hostile things about the apartment management. Story 10. When I was in college, I lived in this tiny, cramped apartment, and next door was a guy with the most sensitive hearing ever. We called him the Goob because he looked like an unshelled peanut. We really couldn't stand him. One night, my friend was over and we were watching our favorite TV show. We had the volume so low that we were literally sitting just 2.5 feet from the TV to hear it, and there was nothing wrong with our hearing. It wasn't even 8 p.m. yet, when suddenly, there was a knock at the door. And of course, it was the Goob asking us to turn down the volume because he could hear it from his apartment. We were like, what the heck? We invited him in to show him how low the volume was, but he refused and kept going on about how it was disturbing him. Finally, my friend snapped and just let loose on him. The Goob threatened to call the police if we didn't turn it down, and we both said, "Fine. Call them," and slammed the door in his face. Nothing came of it. He never bothered us again after that. Story 11. I grew up in a house that had 3 apartments, 2 of which were spacious enough for a family of 4 to live comfortably. The third was a small basement apartment, suitable for 1 or 2 people, with just a single room, a kitchen, and a bathroom. The basement apartment had a typical student vibe, or like something someone would rent when they first move out of their parents' home. Despite being in the basement, it wasn't too dark or dreary since the basement wasn't entirely underground, and it still had windows that let in some natural light. A couple lived in the basement, and they always seemed a little off. They were probably in their 40s and definitely didn't seem like they belonged in an apartment like that. Both were quite overweight, very withdrawn, and never greeted anyone. They hardly ever went outside, never seemed to do any shopping, and gave off a strange vibe, almost like they were hiding something or felt embarrassed about something. I know it sounds bad, but they just had that unsettling, stereotypical look to them, like they were hiding something dark or had odd tendencies. One day, my older sister and I came home, and suddenly we heard the sound of bare feet running down the driveway. Before we could process what was happening, the woman from the basement apartment ran past us, completely bare. She had her hands on her hips and her head tilted back like she was posing proudly. She stopped in the middle of a busy street, just standing there for a moment. We didn't stick around to find out what she did next because my sister quickly unlocked the door so we could get inside and avoid being seen. Not long after that bizarre incident, they moved out. By then, we were in the process of buying the house, so we went in to start renovations. The basement apartment was cold and dark, with concrete floors and walls. The ceiling was covered with white, foam tile panels, and there was a rectangular pit in the concrete floor, deep enough to come up to your knees. I couldn't help but think they might have used it as a bed or sleeping area. Story 12. There was an old man who lived across the street with his sister and mother while I was in my junior and senior years of college. The man had a room with a large sliding glass door that looked out onto the street. At all hours of the night, you could see him standing there, backlit by the flicker of his TV. It was unsettling at first, but the more it happened, the more disturbing it became. Both my roommate and my significant other had mentioned that they felt uncomfortable, as the man would seem to be watching them at night. One evening, I peered through our peephole and saw him standing bare in front of the window. It was late and the street was empty, so while I thought he was an odd, creepy old man, I didn't think too much about it at the time. A few nights later though, my roommate's partner came into our house, visibly upset, and explained that the neighbor had been doing inappropriate things in front of the window. My roommate quickly ran outside, and the neighbor retreated back into his house. After that, the man tried to make amends by speaking to me every chance he got. I was short and direct with him, making it clear I had no interest in conversing, but he never seemed to be around when my roommate was home. His mother and sister, in contrast, were kind, sweet, and funny. The old man, however, was just a disgusting, creepy pervert. Story 13. I used to live in an apartment complex where my front door faced the patio balconies of the apartments across the driveway. One of those balconies always had a silhouette of a person standing in the sliding glass door, looking out. It was there at all hours, in the exact same spot and position. After a few months, I decided it must just be a cardboard cutout. The sliding door was decorated with outdoor party lights that were always on, adding to the odd vibe. But over time I got used to it. It became just another quirk of the place, and I stopped thinking much about it. About a year after moving in, something happened that completely shattered my assumption. Early one morning around 5 a.m., I went outside to take the trash out. It was still dark and everything was quiet, until the party lights on that balcony suddenly started flashing on and off. Confused, I glanced up to see what was happening. That's when I noticed the silhouette wasn't just standing still anymore. It was moving. I could clearly see an arm flicking the light switch up and down. That's when it hit me. The silhouette I'd been seeing for a year wasn't a cardboard cutout at all. It was an actual person, standing there every day, quietly watching everything happening outside. To this day, I have no idea why they were flashing the lights that morning. Maybe to get my attention? Whatever the reason, it was undeniably creepy to realize that this figure I'd dismissed as an inanimate object was a real person, silently observing the world for an entire year. Story 14. Growing up, our next-door neighbor's adult son still lived at home. He was a bit odd and would often just stare at us when we were outside playing. He never spoke, no matter how much we waved or said hello. It was kind of creepy, but we'd heard he was mentally disabled, so we just chalked it up to that. Then one day we came home to find a bunch of police cars and officers everywhere. We found out he had attempted to abduct 2 other kids in the neighborhood. After that, we weren't really allowed to play outside anymore. Story 15. There was this crazy cat lady who lived in a trailer surrounded by overgrown weeds and brush. For some reason, she had a toilet sitting in her front yard. One day, while it was pouring rain, she walked down our driveway and handed my dad a cardboard box, saying, "The Mexican government is after me. I can't care for these, take them." Inside the box were 2 3-week-old kittens, a brother and sister. Sadly, the brother passed away due to a bowel problem, but we still have the female to this day. She's fat, sassy, and can never seem to keep her tongue in her mouth, and I love her. The crazy lady would often set random fires in her yard and scream at helicopters. It's not as creepy now since I've gotten used to her, but when I was little, I always checked my closet to make sure she wasn't hiding in it for some weird reason. Story 16. My older sister and I shared a room for a long time. I'm a guy. Our room had a big window facing the street, and one day, as I was changing out of my soccer uniform, I happened to look out and saw our neighbor across the street staring at me while I changed. I quickly closed the curtains, but less than 15 minutes later, he knocked on the door. He tried to explain that he wasn't gay or a pedo, but that he thought it was usually my sister changing at that time, which is why he was looking. I told him she was only 14, she was tall and developed early for her age, and his creepy smile immediately turned to shock as my dad pulled up from work. He moved away within a month, and from then on, we kept the curtains closed. Story 17. I have an upstairs neighbor who's been pretty unsettling. He disappears for weeks at a time, but when he's back, we're suddenly hearing what sounds like a mosh pit happening at 11 p.m. on a weeknight, his way of announcing he's home. A lot of strange things have happened, but the top 2 incidents really give you an idea of how creepy he is. One day, I was bringing up groceries and he offered to help. I said thank you and assumed he'd just take the bags to the landing on the 2nd floor, leave them outside my door, and then continue up to his apartment, just like another neighbor had done before. But no. He followed me back to my car and stood inches behind me while I was leaning into the trunk to grab the last 2 bags. He then took all the bags from me and walked upstairs. As I was saying, "Oh thank you, you really didn't have to do that," he replied, "No problem. I know your old man leaves for work early and you're home alone." I barely opened my apartment door when he walked in. He opened the fridge, put the milk in, and started looking around our apartment, peeking into our bedroom. For context, I didn't flip out because it was 8 a.m. and the 2 other people in our building were gone. No one would have heard me if I screamed. He's about 6 feet 2 inches, and I'm 5 feet 5 inches at best, so it's not like I could have done much. I said, "Okay, thanks for the help, I'll see you around." But he kept digging through the fridge and eyeing the bedroom. As he took a step toward me, he noticed I had a large butcher knife only a few inches from my hand. That made him leave. I called my husband, crying, to tell him what happened. He confronted the guy the next day, but he wouldn't answer the door. The day after, my husband went up again, and the guy broke down crying, claiming he didn't remember anything and was just trying to be friendly. My husband just said, "My wife can carry the groceries herself." Another night, we woke up to yelling and screaming outside. When we looked out the window, we saw the upstairs neighbor with blood streaming down his face, so drunk, or maybe high, that he could barely stand. He was screaming at the police, saying, "I'm not going to the damn hospital." Apparently, he'd gotten into a fight at a pool hall nearby and got beat up by a group of guys. Eventually, the police got him under control and took him away in cuffs. The next morning, I went out to get groceries while my husband stayed home. When I came back, my neighbor was standing outside smoking a cigarette, still looking pretty intoxicated. This time, he walked up to my car, acting like he was waiting for me to get out, and just stood by the trunk. This was the first time I had seen him since the earlier incident when my husband could have been away. I called my husband, and as soon as he heard me on the phone and saw my husband coming downstairs, the guy bolted. That day, my husband took me to buy a gun. Now, whenever my neighbor sees me alone, he just stares. But when my husband is with me, he pretends not to notice us at all. Story 18. My neighbor lived with his parents his whole life because he couldn't work due to a psychological disorder, though I'm not sure exactly what it was. He spends all day walking around his house, inspecting it from every angle. He's constantly watching either his house or his car in the garage. Sometimes he's just inside, staring out the window absently. When you walk past him and greet him, he never responds. He doesn't seem to notice at all. Occasionally he walks around the block carrying an old leather suitcase and wearing sunglasses, but he always returns quickly. If he notices something out of the ordinary, he calls the police. He's done this for things like when someone turns their car around in his driveway or parks near it. When I was a kid, if our parents parked near his driveway for birthday parties to pick up their kids, he'd often call the police. Whenever I come home late at night, his front door is always slightly open, with him sitting behind it, watching. Sometimes, when friends are over and we go outside for a smoke at night, he'll come out and head to his garage. He's got bright lights installed, and he'll pretend to check his car, at 4 a.m. of course. It's disturbing, but after a while, you kind of get used to it. On the bright side, though, we never worry about burglars breaking into our house because we know our neighbor is always watching. Story 19. This is an unsettling experience I had once. I was outside my parents' house looking for their dog, which had run away. I walked over to the house across the street to check if the dog might have wandered into their backyard. While I was there, I noticed a pile of cigarette butts outside one of the basement windows. It seemed strange because the neighbors don't smoke, and they have 3 kids, the oldest being a girl around 10 years old, so I doubted their kids were sneaking smokes. As I looked at the pile of cigarette butts, I glanced inside the window and realized it was the daughter's room. The next day, I was at my parents' house feeding the dog when I saw the neighbor's next-door neighbor outside washing his car. He was smoking and tossed his cigarette butt in the gutter. On a whim, I went over to where it landed and checked it, same brand as the ones outside the basement window. It hit me then. The guy had been sitting outside the girl's window at night, smoking, and watching her for long enough to leave a pile of cigarette butts there. I really didn't want to think about what else he might have been doing while watching a 10-year-old girl sleep. He just carelessly tossed his cigarette butts on the ground instead of cleaning them up. So, I went over and told the neighbors across the street about it. How someone who smokes the same brand as their next-door neighbor had been leaving a pile of butts outside their daughter's window. It caused a huge uproar. Story 20. I've noticed some strange things about one of my neighbors since I moved in. My roommate and I first observed that he was always sitting on his front porch smoking. He never made eye contact or responded when we'd walk past and say hello. Over time, we realized he walks around a lot, often at odd hours. I've seen him walking in the middle of the road in the middle of the night, a couple of miles away from our apartments. What makes it even weirder is that he walks in this slow, robotic manner. I once had to call maintenance, and the maintenance guy mentioned that my neighbor has this habit of taking envelopes, writing Animal Planet over and over on them, and taping them to stop signs. The maintenance guy also told me that he once had to fix a clogged toilet in the neighbor's apartment and found that someone had flushed a bunch of car parts down it. Last week, I had to run some errands, and when I stepped outside, I saw my neighbor standing in front of his apartment, spraying a few large rocks with a hose and staring at them. A few days later, I had some friends over for drinks, and after everyone had left, one friend and I were sitting on my porch smoking when we saw my neighbor spraying something on his car, though it never moves. He was spraying it for about 10 minutes, and then he went inside. A moment later, he came back out with a hose and decided it was time to wash his car, at 2 a.m. But he didn't spray the car. He just walked around it with the hose in hand, before going back inside. For the next 10 to 15 minutes, while my friend and I were talking, he kept walking in large circles around the parking lot, coming back inside, only to step back out shortly after. Story 21. My neighbor across the street is a lawyer, married to a woman who was a real battle axe. They had 2 sons, and the mother always acted like her kids were better than everyone else. She'd even tell my cousin he wasn't good enough to talk to them and would pull them away whenever they interacted with other kids. As time went on, the younger son started becoming increasingly unstable. He'd hide in bushes around the neighborhood and jump out at people, howling at them, and I once caught him throwing batteries at my dog. By the time he reached high school, his behavior became more erratic. Apparently, he went online, bought guns, and started stockpiling them in the walls of his house. From what I heard, the feds caught wind of it and confiscated the guns. After that, he really started to lose it. He always had random cars parked in the road that he was supposedly working on, no idea where he kept getting them from. He'd stop any neighbor walking down the street and ramble to them, including my parents and little cousins. It was hard to follow what he was saying because it never made sense. From what I pieced together, he thought they or the government was after him, convinced that people were setting up cameras and stalking him around his house. To protect himself, he bought a new dog, his old one had disappeared a while ago, and began installing cameras, or at least what looked like cameras, in his trees. He spent a lot of time sitting on his roof, keeping watch. Honestly, I'm just waiting for the day the police raid his house and find out he's killed his parents. The guy is clearly unhinged, and I hate that he's free to roam the street where I live. Story 22. When I was in my early teens, living at home, there was a boy about 2 or 3 years younger than me who lived a few houses down. I'll call him Josh. We weren't really friends, but sometimes he, his younger sister Sasha, and I would play together. A few years later, a neighborhood friend of mine, Steve, came banging on my door for help. His garage was on fire, and his parents weren't home. It was just him and his younger sister in the house. I called 911, then ran over to make sure his sister was safe. The fire department arrived and put out the fire, but the garage was destroyed. Fortunately, the rest of the house was spared. The police started questioning people in the neighborhood and discovered that several people had seen a young boy hanging around Steve's house and other houses that day. Upon further inspection, it turned out that multiple garages, including mine, had suspiciously flammable liquids on the floor, along with splinters from wooden matches nearby. In my case, it looked like someone had poured motor oil out of a bottle and tried to light it, though it didn't catch fire. It turned out that Josh had severe mental issues and had a history with the police. He was eventually identified as the arsonist. I don't know what happened to him after that, but I never spoke to him again. I would occasionally see him outside his house, like mowing the lawn, but that was about it. The neighborhood rumor was that Josh had been emotionally and possibly physically abused by his father, who I never saw, and he had been arrested for things like shoplifting, assault, and animal abuse. About 10 years later, I ran into Sasha at a local mall. She was in high school by then and had adopted the stereotypical white trash look and attitude. We talked for a few minutes, during which she confessed that when she was 8 and I was 16, she had a huge crush on me. Then, she said if I gave her a ride home, I could do whatever I wanted with her, as long as I didn't leave any marks. I gave her the ride home but didn't do anything further. Story 23. When I was a kid, our neighborhood was full of kids around the same age, but there was this one guy who was about 15 years older than most of us. He'd sometimes join us for games when we were outside, and while it felt almost wholesome, there was always a bit of an odd vibe. He never asked to come inside and we never invited him, he just played games with us outdoors. One time, while we were playing catch, we decided to take a break to get some water. He asked if he could come in too because he didn't want to walk all the way home for water just to come back. We didn't think anything of it and said, "Of course, friend." Once inside, he mentioned needing to use the bathroom. After about 15 minutes, we realized he hadn't come back, so we went looking for him. That's when we found him in my room, in my walk-in closet. He looked up at us and casually said, "Oh, sorry, I got distracted. Ready to play more?" As a kid, I just thought, what a weirdo, and shrugged it off. But looking back now as an adult, I really wish I'd told him to leave and immediately told my parents. It's so unsettling to think about now, especially since I had bladder problems back then and still wore pull-ups at night. The thought of this guy rummaging through my room like he was some kind of big brother, it's just creepy. Story 24. I have 2 very unique neighbors, both of whom are still very active in the neighborhood. The first one was a woman who knocked on my door one day, no car in sight, which struck me as odd at first. I didn't realize she lived just 2 doors down at the time. She introduced herself and explained that she was my neighbor, which explained the lack of a car, and then launched into this bizarre story. She told me her phone's GPS was showing her location as being at my house, and she was convinced hackers had gotten into her phone. Apparently, her husband keeps an eye on her Google Maps location, and it was showing she was at my house. I work in IT, so I had a lot of ideas about what could be causing the issue, but honestly, I just brushed it off as one of those random quirks of tech. She eventually left, and I didn't think much of it. Later, I met her husband, and let's just say he's a full-on conspiracy theorist, straight-up tin-foil hat territory, convinced the government is out to get him. Now, the second neighbor lives right next to Mr. Tinfoil Hat and has his own special brand of charm. He bought a vacant 3-acre lot next to my house at an estate sale, which also borders another property he already owns. I had tried to buy an acre of that land myself, but unfortunately, it didn't pan out. I only managed to snag a 20-foot strip. That 20 feet turned out to be significant because the decorative trees lining my driveway actually sit on that land. Before he even finalized the purchase, he came over to ask if I planned on maintaining the trees. If not, he said he'd cut them down. I didn't want the driveway looking uneven, so I agreed to take care of them. In the end, it worked out. Well, sort of. Here's where it gets frustrating. His property line extends 12 feet past mine, and he loves to drive his truck across that stretch of land, which just so happens to be my driveway and culvert. His constant driving has caused damage to my driveway, making it sink. Unfortunately, since the driveway is in a right-of-way, it's on me to fix it, and I can't legally stop him from driving over it. To make things worse, he's the nosiest person I've ever met. He'll walk right up to the property line and just stare at whatever we're doing on our side. He also cleared out all the trees and brush that used to provide privacy from the 2 neighbors behind us. I forgot to mention the swing he has in this empty lot that faces our house. He creeps my kids out, so now we are looking to put up a privacy fence. Story 25. My neighbor is my uncle. Middle-aged, creepy, every time we come into his house there are a lot of corn DVDs laying around. He is into conspiracy theories, QAnon, and all that shit. He gets into trouble very easily because he is deeply convinced that everyone is following him. He shouts at the postman, at people in grocery store, basically at everyone. Once he went in the main square of the town to see fireworks and punched a guy who was recording the fireworks on his phone because he was deeply convinced that the guy was recording him on the behalf of the government. He is a flat-earther, an anti-vaxxer, and convinced that the government is composed by holograms under the secret rule of lizard people. Wish I was kidding. His girlfriend is not a bad woman, but she ain't the sharpest tool in the shed. She has 2 sons from a previous marriage. One isn't exactly brilliant but can build professional bikes from the ground up and is overall an okay guy, very into cycling and sporty. The other was the sweetest kid, at some point started to become exactly like my uncle, very withdrawn, and every time he sees you, he stares into your soul without blinking for 5 minutes straight. He never talks outside of the house, never. We don't live in the USA, and my dad sometimes says that, if we didn't have strong gun control laws, he would probably end up shooting someone in a very public place. Story 26. When we bought our house, we didn't realize that shared driveways were even a thing. But after seeing that the shared portion was tiny, the driveway itself was huge, and the neighboring rental house had been vacant for a long time, we decided to go through with the purchase anyway. About 10 days after we moved in, a woman and her truck driver boyfriend moved into the rental next door. They had the power company raise the power lines so he could park his semi-truck in the shared driveway, right in the middle of Main Street, in the center of town. 2 weeks after we moved in, I was rear-ended in front of my house while trying to turn into the driveway. I badly injured my neck in the accident, which left me unable to work and stayed home all the time. The rental house constantly emitted a burnt trash smell. Our youngest, who was in 2nd grade at the time, couldn't play outside without close supervision because sometimes the fumes were overwhelming. She also burned yard waste at odd hours, adding to the problem. Then came the late-night police calls. At 2 a.m., she'd frequently call the cops, accusing us of harboring black men in our basement. While we did have African-American friends and coworkers, we certainly didn't have people over late at night, especially since my husband wakes up at 4 a.m. for work. Not that this would justify calling the police in any case. Another time, she called because a neighbor's dog was crying on a cold winter night. That one I supported. The poor dog was kept in a pen outside full-time, and it broke my heart. Regardless of the reason, the police had to investigate every time, waking us up in the process. She also claimed she was dying of cancer, so she demanded that our kids stay quiet and avoid bothering her with their noise. Yet she somehow had the energy to obsessively clean, paint, and even steal roofing tiles from our yard to repair her rental house. Eventually, she moved out, but not before the semi-cracked our asphalt driveway and ripped down some phone lines. Afterward, the owners of the rental listed it for sale at an absurdly high price, way above market value. Unsurprisingly, it didn't sell. Years later, the husband passed away, and the wife decided to relist it at a fair price. The moment it hit the market, we bought it. We've owned the property for 12 years now and spent a long time debating whether we should rent it out. Ultimately, we decided against it. My husband and son recently cleared out the attic, and my son swears he found and threw away old crack pipes. Just a couple of days ago, the power company pulled the gas lines, so we're finally ready to tear it down. Soon, I'll be enjoying a brand new, large, heated garage in its place, and I can't wait. Story 27. My neighbor was Matthew Ridgway, son of the Green River Killer. Several years ago, I lived in a side-by-side duplex. I was a single mom and a college student, around 24 at the time. A nice couple moved in next door, probably in their late 20s or early 30s. The wife was very friendly and chatty, sometimes to an uncomfortable extent. She'd share really personal details about her life, stuff that went way beyond normal neighborly conversation. Neither of them worked. He had been in the military, and I got the impression she collected Social Security for some injury or health condition. They seemed to have things worked out because they always had enough money, paid their rent on time, and had things together. One day, the three of us were sitting on the shared front porch, smoking. She started telling me how, a few years back, she had struggled with depression after they lost a baby and had started taking medication. She said it had been a difficult time in their lives, and she was under a lot of stress. Then, she turned to her husband and asked, "Should I tell her, honey?" He just shrugged, like he usually did, barely saying anything. So, she turned back to me and announced, "Matt's dad was the Green River Killer." I was completely taken aback and didn't know what to say. I had heard of the Green River Killer but wasn't fully familiar with the details. But she filled me in. He had murdered a lot of women around the Green River in King County, Washington. She went on to explain how Matt had been in the military when the FBI showed up one day, pulled him out of duty, and told him, "We just arrested your father for the Green River murders." They took Matt away from the base and did all kinds of psychological tests on him to make sure he wasn't unstable. Apparently, Gary, Matt's father, had been a suspect for years, but the investigation took a long time. Matt told me that his parents were divorced, and his mother had always known her ex-husband was a suspect. He said that it was eerie to think about sending your kids to stay with a father who might have murdered 48 women. During the trial, Matt recalled a memory from when he was younger. His father had picked up a woman with Matt in the car, then parked out in the woods. He left Matt alone in the car, telling him he'd be back soon. When he came back without the woman, Matt asked where she was, and Gary told him he had walked her home. As a single mom living alone, I'll admit this really creeped me out, especially when I was alone with Matt. But despite everything, he was a really nice guy. They were quirky and weird, but overall, they were kind and friendly. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.